The night was alive with glittering lights and soft laughter. Inside the grand mansion, chandeliers sparkled like stars and guests in expensive clothes walked across marble floors. The smell of perfume, wine, and roasted food filled the air. It was another one of the Millionaire's parties, where rich men and women came only to show off and gossip. At the center of it all sat Mr. Adrian, the proud owner of the house. He was known everywhere for his money, his sharp suits, and his arrogant way of speaking. People didn't come to love him. They came because of his wealth. In the corner of the room, almost invisible to the guests, was a young woman. Her name was Clara. She wore a plain gray dress that looked worn from washing too many times. Her shoes were old, her hands were rough, and her hair was tied back neatly. She wasn't there to enjoy the party. She was the caretaker, the one who swept the floors, dusted the furniture, and kept the mansion shining so Adrian could show it off. She moved quietly as if she wanted no one to notice her. But that night, as she wiped dust from the edge of the grand piano, she suddenly caught Adrian's attention. He had just finished telling a story to his guests, making them laugh loudly, when his eyes landed on her. A sly smile crept across his face. He liked to remind everyone of their place, and Clara was an easy target. "Look at her," Adrian said loudly enough for the guests to hear, "so serious about cleaning my piano as if she owns it." His friends chuckled, watching Clara lower her head. He leaned back in his chair, enjoying the moment. "Tell me, girl," he called out, "can you even play this piano? Or do you just know how to clean it?" The guests laughed harder. Clara froze. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment. She wanted to walk away, but her feet felt heavy. She had grown used to being ignored, but being mocked in front of so many people made her chest tighten with shame. She stayed silent, hoping the moment would pass, but Adrian wasn't done. He thrived on humiliation. "I'll tell you what," he said, raising his glass of wine. "If you can play something worth listening to, I'll marry you right here." The hall erupted in laughter. To them, it was just a cruel joke, entertainment for the evening. Clara's heart pounded. Inside her, an old ache stirred because once upon a time music had been her dream. As a child, she had sat at a wooden piano in a small school hall practicing until her fingers hurt. She loved how music could tell stories without words. But life had not been kind. Poverty forced her to leave her lessons. Her father's sickness drained what little money they had, and eventually she gave up on her dream completely. Now she cleaned other people's pianos instead of playing them. The sound of laughter pulled her back to the present. Adrian's guests were still mocking her. She felt her throat tighten, her pride battling against her fear. She told herself to stay quiet, to keep her head down. Caretakers were not meant to answer back. Yet something inside her whispered that silence would make the pain worse. Adrian's mocking eyes stayed fixed on her, waiting for her to shrink away. He was certain she would, certain that she was nothing but a servant with no courage. He had no idea that under her simple clothes, behind her quiet nature, lived a heart that still remembered the language of music. Clara's hands pressed against the polished surface of the piano, and for a brief second she closed her eyes. She could almost feel the weight of her childhood dreams returning. The room grew louder with laughter, but inside her head she heard only the echo of melodies she once loved. The party, the expensive gowns, the chandeliers, all of it felt like a cruel stage. Yet in that moment, something stronger than humiliation began to rise in her chest. She opened her eyes, lifted her chin slightly, and stared at Adrian, not with anger, not with tears, but with a quiet courage he had not expected. The room was still filled with noise, but a strange tension began to form. Some of the guests leaned closer, curious to see how the caretaker would respond. Would she run away in shame, or would she surprise them? And there she stood, a simple caretaker among the powerful, facing the laughter of the rich. What no one knew, not even Adrian, was that his cruel joke had just awakened something in her that had been silent for far too long. Clara returned to her duties as the party continued, but her heart was restless. The laughter of the guests still rang in her ears. Their mocking faces, their cruel smiles, they clung to her mind like shadows. She walked quietly around the room, carrying an empty tray, pretending not to hear the whispers that followed her. Yet deep inside she carried a secret that none of them knew. Once, many years ago, Clara had been more than just a caretaker. She had been a student of music. Her fingers had danced across piano keys in her childhood, filling her small home with songs that made her parents smile. She remembered sitting at the old piano in her school hall, the keys chipped and uneven yet magical under her touch. Her teacher had said she had a gift, that her heart spoke through the notes she played, but life had not been fair. Her father fell ill, and medical bills drained everything the family owned. Clara left her lessons to work. She took small jobs, cleaning houses, washing clothes, and eventually found work as a caretaker in Adrian's mansion. The piano became a memory, something she loved but could never touch again. Each time she passed by the grand piano in the hall, she felt a sharp pain inside. It stood there shining, silent, reminding her of dreams she had buried. That night when Adrian mocked her, those memories returned with force. She wanted to cry, but instead she bit her lip and stayed strong. She knew he expected her to remain silent, to let his joke end like all the others. But his words had cut deeper than the rest, because they touched the one thing she had loved most. The guests had already forgotten about her, moving back to their drinks and laughter. But Clara's mind was still locked on the piano. She remembered the sound of her teacher's voice. "Clara, never let the world silence your gift." She wondered if she still had that gift. Could her hands, after so many years, still create the music that once lived inside her? Or had the hard years of work erased that part of her forever? Her eyes fell on Adrian again. He was leaning back in his chair, his glass of wine raised, enjoying the admiration of his guests. To him, she was invisible again, just a servant walking in the background. But inside she felt something stirring, something that told her she should not let his cruelty be the end of the story. She began to recall the songs she used to play, soft lullabies her mother had loved, bold pieces she had practiced until her fingers hurt, gentle melodies that made even her strict teacher smile. The music had been a language for her, a way to speak when words felt too weak. That language was still inside her, quiet but alive, waiting to be spoken again. As she moved past the piano once more, she slowed her steps. Her hand brushed against the smooth wood. The touch sent a shiver through her as though the instrument itself remembered her. She pulled her hand back quickly, worried someone had seen her. But no one was looking. The thought came suddenly, strong and dangerous. What if I play? The idea frightened her. If she failed, the guests would laugh louder than ever. Adrian would crush her spirit with one more cruel smile. She would be nothing but a joke in their memory. But another thought pushed against her fear. What if I succeed? What if for one moment they heard her music? What if she could remind them and herself who she truly was? Her heart beat faster. She imagined herself sitting on the piano bench, her fingers trembling at first, then finding strength. She imagined the silence in the room as the first notes rose. She imagined the faces of the guests, shocked and silenced by something they had never expected from a simple caretaker. She imagined Adrian's smile fading, replaced by something he couldn't control, respect or maybe even awe. The fear and hope battled inside her. For years she had hidden her gift, afraid of being judged, afraid of being reminded of everything she had lost. But maybe it was time to stop hiding. Maybe this was the moment her life had been waiting for. She whispered to herself as she set down the empty tray. I can still play. I know I can. Her voice was low but steady. She looked again at the piano, its keys gleaming under the golden lights. It was no longer just furniture in a rich man's house. It was her chance to rise above the life that had been forced upon her. Around her, the party carried on with laughter and noise. No one cared about the caretaker moving quietly in the shadows. But Clara knew a choice lay before her. She could remain silent, safe in the corner where no one expected anything of her. Or she could step into the light, sit at the piano, and risk everything. Her heart told her the answer. She had spent too many years cleaning, too many years pretending her dreams did not matter. Tonight, with her dignity on the line, she could not stay silent. Tonight, she would remind them and herself who she truly was. She took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the piano. The decision was made. The room was alive with music from the band and the loud chatter of the guests, but Clara heard none of it. Her mind was filled with only one thought, the piano. She walked past it again, her heart pounding in her chest. Every step felt heavier than the last. She knew the risk she was about to take. If she failed, she would not only embarrass herself but give Adrian and his guests a story to laugh about for years. Yet something inside her was stronger than the fear. Adrian noticed her slowing near the piano and smirked. "What is it, caretaker?" he said loudly, his voice cutting through the laughter. "Do you want to try?" "Do you dare?" His friends laughed with him. their glasses raised in mockery. They expected her to blush, stammer, and walk away. They wanted her to stay in her place. Clara stopped. She could have turned back. She could have chosen silence again. But instead she turned to Adrian and with a steady voice said, "Yes, may I touch the keys?" The laughter that followed was sharper this time. Some guests almost spilled their drinks from laughing too hard. "Did you hear that?" One woman whispered loudly, covering her mouth in fake shock. "The caretaker thinks she can play." But Adrian leaned forward, curious now. He had expected her to shrink away, not answer back. For a moment he studied her face, searching for hesitation. To his surprise, her eyes did not look frightened. They looked calm, almost determined. His smirk widened. "Go on then," he said, waving his hand toward the piano. "Entertain us. Show us this hidden talent." The hall grew quieter. Some guests leaned closer, eager to see the caretaker humiliate herself. A few crossed their arms, certain it would be a waste of time. But all of them turned to watch as Clara slowly walked toward the piano. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the bench. She sat down carefully, her plain dress brushing against the polished wood. She placed her hands in her lap for a moment, breathing deeply, gathering the courage she had buried for years. The weight of all the eyes on her pressed down heavily, but she didn't look up. She kept her gaze on the piano. Adrian raised his glass, ready for the show. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with exaggerated cheer, "we are about to witness a performance from my caretaker. Remember, she promised to marry me if she plays well." The guests burst into another wave of laughter. Some clapped mockingly as if encouraging a child. Clara closed her eyes. She blocked out their voices, their cruel laughter, the glitter of the chandeliers, and even Adrian's mocking tone. She pictured the old piano from her childhood, chipped and scratched, sitting in a dusty school hall. She remembered how her fingers used to find the keys as if they were part of her soul. She remembered her teacher's words. "Clara, music lives inside you. Never let anyone take it away." Her hands lifted slowly, almost unwillingly, and hovered above the keys. Her fingers were stiff, unused to this position after so many years. She pressed down gently on one key. A clear ringing note filled the air. It was soft, almost uncertain, but it cut through the laughter like a knife. The hall went still for a moment. Some smiled cruelly, thinking it was only luck. But Clara didn't stop. She let her other hand join, pressing 2 more keys. The sound was shaky, uneven, but her heart began to settle. She could feel the old rhythm stirring in her veins like a bird spreading its wings for the first time after years in a cage. The guests leaned forward. Their laughter faded into silence. They were waiting, curious now, wondering if she would continue or stop. Adrian narrowed his eyes slightly, his smirk still there but softer, uncertain. Clara's fingers rested on the keys. Her chest rose and fell with each breath, her heart racing. She knew this was the moment. The line between humiliation and revelation. She could still walk away, claim it was a mistake, save herself from the risk. But deep inside, she knew she could not turn back now. The music was calling her, louder than her fear. She pressed another chord, then another. This time the notes came smoother, stronger, carrying with them the echo of all the years she had kept silent. It was not yet a song, only fragments, but already the sound carried weight. The grand hall, filled moments earlier with laughter and pride, now listened. The caretaker, mocked and underestimated, had accepted the challenge. And as her fingers began to settle on the keys, the night shifted. Something in the air changed, something even Adrian could feel but could not name. The first note had been played. Clara's hands hovered above the piano, her fingers gently touching the keys as if greeting an old friend after many years. Her heart still raced, but something inside her had shifted. The fear was still there, hiding in the corners of her mind, but it was no longer in control. She pressed down again. A soft melody began to rise like a whisper in a crowded room. At first it was gentle, simple, just a few notes strung together. But there was something in those notes. Something real. Something pure. The guests didn't understand it at first. Many of them were still half smiling, waiting for her to mess up. But the laughter had stopped. The clinking of glasses grew quiet. One by one, heads turned toward the piano. Eyes began to watch more closely. Conversations faded. Even the servants paused in their tracks. The melody grew. Clara's fingers started to move with more confidence, more speed. She remembered the feeling now. The way the keys spoke back when you touched them just right. The way music could tell a story without a single word. It was like her soul had been locked behind a door for years, and now, suddenly, that door had opened. The song she played wasn't one written in books. It was something she had created in her childhood. A tune she used to hum while walking home from school. A tune she played at night when the world felt too heavy. That old melody came back to her now, flowing from her fingertips like water from a spring. Adrian sat in his chair, his smile gone. He had expected a joke, a disaster, something to laugh about. But this wasn't funny. This was something else. His guests weren't laughing either. Some were frozen, their eyes wide. A few had their hands on their chests, as if the music had reached into them and touched something forgotten. The song grew deeper, stronger. Her hands moved quickly now, flowing across the piano like wind through trees. She was no longer thinking about the people watching. She had forgotten about the mansion, the rich guests, even Adrian. Her world had become just her, the piano and the music. The melody rose and fell like waves. It danced, it cried, it whispered secrets only a broken heart could understand. The guests could feel it. They didn't know her story, but somehow they felt her pain, her strength, her quiet beauty. A woman near the front wiped away a tear. A man who had laughed the loudest earlier now sat quietly, staring at the piano as if in a trance. The room was full yet silent. No one dared speak. No one dared move. It was as if time had stopped to listen. Clara's face showed no pride, no anger, no fear. Only peace. She was lost in the sound, and it showed. Each note she played was a piece of herself, a memory, a hope, a scar. And with each note she gave a little more of her soul to the room. Even Adrian felt it. He tried to stay relaxed, tried to remind himself that she was still just a caretaker. But the music made that impossible. It was too real, too powerful. It filled every corner of the hall, wrapped around every guest and pulled them into Clara's world. He remembered something. His mother, long ago, playing the piano when he was a boy. She used to sing to him when he was sick, used to say that music was the heart's voice. He hadn't thought of that in years. He had buried that memory under layers of money, power, and pride. But now Clara's music was digging it back up. As the final notes of the song began, the room felt like it was holding its breath. Clara's fingers slowed. The melody softened like a candle fading in the night. She touched the last note gently, letting it ring in the silence. Then her hands lifted away. Silence. Pure, heavy silence. No one moved. No one clapped. Not yet. They were still under the spell of what they had heard. The air felt thick with emotion. The woman who had cried looked at Clara with awe. One man whispered, "That was beautiful." But his voice was barely more than a breath. Clara slowly stood from the bench, her head lowered. She didn't bow. She didn't smile. She didn't wait for praise. She had played not to impress them, but to free herself. She stepped back from the piano, her hands now still, her face calm. And in that moment, she was no longer just the caretaker. She was the one who had silenced a room full of the proud and powerful, with nothing but music, and they would never forget it. Clara stood beside the piano, her hands still, her eyes down. The last note of her song had faded, but the feeling it left behind stayed in the air like perfume. The large hall, once filled with laughter and pride, now stood in silence. No one was speaking. No one was moving. It was as if the music had tied everyone's tongue, had wrapped around their hearts and held them still. For a long moment, Clara didn't dare look up. She didn't know what their faces looked like now. Were they still mocking her silently? Were they confused? Or had they understood the music? She had not played to impress them, but still, part of her heart was afraid. Then someone clapped just once. The sound echoed in the quiet room. Then another person clapped and another. Slowly, the sound of hands coming together filled the space. But this time it was not fake or polite applause. It was real. It was honest. People weren't clapping because they were told to. They were clapping because they felt something. Clara lifted her head. She saw the faces in the crowd. They were not laughing anymore. Some looked amazed. Some looked embarrassed. A few looked like they didn't know what to do. The woman in the red dress had tears in her eyes. The man with the golden watch had his arms crossed, but his face was soft, thoughtful. And then there was Adrian. He was still in his chair, not clapping, not smiling. His eyes were locked on Clara. But something had changed in them. The arrogant sparkle was gone. He looked shaken, like someone who had seen a ghost or heard a truth too big to ignore. Clara stood still, not sure what to do next. The clapping continued, louder now. A few people stood up. Not many, but enough. Enough to show respect. Enough to show they had been moved. The piano stood quietly behind her, almost glowing under the lights. It was no longer just a piece of furniture in a rich man's house. It had become a voice, a witness. It had told her story when she could not speak it in words. Adrian finally stood up. The crowd grew quiet again, unsure what he would say or do. He took a step forward, his eyes never leaving Clara. Everyone turned to watch him. He was the host, the rich man, the one who had started the joke. Now he looked like someone who wasn't sure if the joke had turned back on him. He opened his mouth to speak, but for a moment no words came out. He looked at Clara, really looked at her, not as a caretaker, not as someone beneath him, but as someone who had done something none of them could. She had reached into every heart in that room without a single word. Finally, he said, "Where did you learn to play like that?" His voice was low. It didn't carry pride like before. It was almost humble. Clara's voice was soft but steady. "I used to play when I was younger." "Before life got in the way?" Adrian nodded slowly, still watching her. "That was..." He stopped, searching for the right word. That was something else. No more jokes. No more laughter. The room was still quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when people are thinking deeply. Someone from the crowd asked, "Why didn't you tell anyone you could play?" Clara smiled gently. "Because people don't always care to listen. They see the uniform, the work, the class, not the person." Her words hit harder than any music. Heads nodded. A few looked down in shame. A guest stepped forward. "Miss, would you play again sometime?" It was not a demand. It was a request. A true one. Clara paused, surprised. Then she said, "Maybe, but not tonight." They accepted that. No one pushed. No one demanded. They had seen enough to understand. Adrian cleared his throat. "I think," he said, "we've all learned something tonight." He turned to the crowd. "I invited you here for wine and entertainment. I thought I'd impress you with food and music machines. But it turns out the most beautiful thing in this house was right in front of me, wearing a caretaker's uniform." It was the closest thing to an apology he had ever spoken in public. Clara felt no joy in his words, only peace. She had not played for him. She had not played for any of them. She had played for herself, for the girl she used to be, for the dream she had buried, and for the voice she thought she'd lost. As she turned to leave the piano, the guests stepped aside for her. Some nodded in respect, some whispered to each other. Others simply watched her pass. That night, the grandest thing in the millionaire's mansion was not his money, his jewels, or his wine. It was a song born from silence that made them all remember what it meant to feel. After the party ended, most of the guests left in quiet groups, speaking in low voices. Some still looked stunned. Others seemed thoughtful. No one made fun of Clara anymore. They had walked into the mansion expecting a show, wine, and laughter, but they left carrying something different, something they didn't have a name for. Clara stayed behind. The music still echoed in her chest like a soft heartbeat. She was cleaning the empty glasses slowly, carefully, her mind far away. The grand piano sat silently in the corner, like a friend that had spoken for her and then gone still again. Adrian had disappeared into his private room after the performance. He hadn't said anything else to Clara. She didn't expect him to. After all, he was still the millionaire and she was still the caretaker. But inside Adrian's room, things were not the same. He sat alone on a leather chair near the fireplace, staring into the flames. A glass of untouched wine rested on the table beside him. He had not moved for over an hour. His mind kept replaying the moment Clara touched the piano. He remembered the sound, how it had changed the whole room. He remembered how people stopped laughing, how even he had frozen, unable to look away. He had watched many performances in his life. Famous singers, expensive musicians. But nothing had ever felt like that. It wasn't just music. It was something more. Something deep. Something true. He remembered his mother again. She had died when he was just a teenager. She used to play piano in the living room of their old home. Her music was soft and warm. She used to say, "Music, Adrian, is what keeps your heart from turning cold." He had forgotten those words. He had forgotten her voice. His life had become full of business, numbers, pride, and control. He built walls around himself, walls of money, walls of ego. But Clara's music had broken through them like light through a crack. He stood up suddenly, walked out of the room, and made his way back to the hall. Clara was still there, collecting plates and folding napkins. She looked up in surprise when she saw him. Adrian walked slowly toward her. For the first time, he looked unsure of what to say. He wasn't wearing his usual smirk. His voice when he spoke was quiet. "I owe you an apology," he said. Clara blinked. "For what, sir?" "For everything," he replied. "For mocking you. For assuming you had nothing to offer. For forgetting that. People can be more than they appear." She didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. Her silence was enough. Adrian looked down at the floor. "When I made that joke, I thought it would be funny. I didn't think you'd actually play. I didn't think you could. And when you did," he paused, "you reminded me of something I'd lost. Something I didn't even know I missed." Clara gave him a small smile. "Music has a way of doing that," he nodded. "Yes, it does." For a moment, they both stood there, quiet. The air between them was no longer filled with pride or fear. It was filled with something new, something neither of them had felt in a long time: understanding. Adrian walked over to the piano and placed his hand gently on it. "I used to sit under my mother's piano when she played. I'd close my eyes and pretend the world didn't exist. Tonight when you played, I felt like that little boy again." Clara looked at him with softer eyes. She hadn't known that about him. She had always seen him as cold and proud. But maybe under all that, he was just someone who had forgotten how to feel. "You should play again," Adrian said. "Not just here. You should play for people. You have a gift. It deserves to be heard." Clara shook her head gently. "Life doesn't always make space for gifts. I play when I can." "That's enough," he stepped closer. "Let me help you. Not as a favor, not because I feel guilty, but because the world needs to hear what I heard tonight. You moved people, Clara. You changed something in that room. That matters." She hesitated. No one had ever offered her something like this. Not without expecting something in return. Not without strings. Adrian saw her doubt. "You don't have to decide now," he said. "Just think about it." Clara nodded slowly. "I will." He smiled, a real one, not the kind he wore for guests. "Thank you. For the music, and for waking something in me that I thought was long dead." As Adrian turned to leave, Clara looked at the piano one last time. She reached out and touched one key. A soft note echoed in the empty hall. Just one note, but it was enough. That night something changed, not just for Adrian, but for Clara too. He had remembered what it meant to feel, and she had remembered what it meant to be seen. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the mansion. Everything looked calm and quiet, but something felt different. The house was no longer just a place of cold marble and gold. It held a memory now, a moment from the night before that no one would forget. Clara arrived early, as she always did. She wore her usual plain gray dress, and her hair was tied back neatly. But her eyes looked brighter. Her steps were lighter. She had spent most of the night lying awake, thinking about everything that had happened. She had played the piano in front of the richest people in the city. She had been laughed at, mocked, and challenged, and yet she had silenced them all with her music. Clara walked past the grand piano. It stood silently in the corner, but now it seemed to glow with pride, as if it too remembered the music. She touched it gently with her fingertips. It still felt like a dream. As she dusted the shelves and arranged the cushions, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned and saw Adrian standing there. He looked different too. He wasn't wearing his expensive suit. He had no wine glass in his hand. Instead, he wore a simple shirt and his face looked softer, like a man who had been thinking. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning, sir," Clara replied, her voice polite. He smiled. "No sir today, just Adrian." Clara raised an eyebrow, a little surprised, but she didn't argue. "I've been thinking about what you said," Adrian continued, "about life not making space for gifts." Clara paused her work. She didn't know where this was going. "You were right," Adrian said. "Sometimes life doesn't, but sometimes we have to make space ourselves." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He handed it to her. Clara took it slowly and looked inside. It was a letter from a music foundation, an invitation to audition for a local concert. Clara stared at it in shock. "What is this?" "I made a few calls," Adrian said, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. Used some connections. I told them about your performance. They want to hear you. Clara couldn't speak for a moment. Her hands trembled as she held the envelope. No one had ever believed in her like this before. But I'm just a caretaker, she whispered. No, Adrian said firmly. You're a musician. You've always been one. You just stopped believing it because the world made you forget. Tears formed in Clara's eyes. She looked away quickly, wiping them before they could fall. Thank you, she said softly. Adrian nodded. You don't have to say yes. You don't have to go. But I hope you will. You deserve that chance, Clara smiled. A real full smile. I'll think about it. The day went by quietly. Clara worked as usual, but her mind was far away. She kept hearing her music in her head. She thought of her father, who used to smile when she played. She thought of her teacher, who once said she had something special. And now, someone else saw it too. That evening, as the sky turned orange, Clara sat at the piano again. The house was empty. No guests, no noise, just her and the keys. She played a soft tune. Not loud or fancy, but full of feeling. Suddenly, she heard clapping. She turned around and saw Adrian standing there. He had been watching silently, not wanting to disturb her. That was beautiful, he said. Clara laughed softly. You really like clapping, don't you? He chuckled. Only when it's deserved. There was a quiet moment between them. Not awkward, just peaceful. Like two people who had finally stopped pretending. Adrian took a deep breath. Do you remember what I said at the party? Clara looked at him carefully. About marrying me if I could play? He nodded. It was meant as a joke. A bad one, but now, I wonder if it came from a place I didn't understand back then. Clara didn't answer. Her eyes were calm but unreadable. Adrian smiled nervously. I'm not asking you anything right now. I just want you to know that I see you now. Really see you. And I hope, maybe one day you'll see me too. Clara looked at him for a long time. Then she said, maybe, one day. Adrian nodded, accepting her answer. He didn't push, didn't expect more. For once he understood that real connection takes time. Clara turned back to the piano and began to play again. Adrian sat quietly and listened. There were no crowds, no lights. No wine glasses or expensive laughter. Just a girl and a piano. And a man learning how to listen. Weeks passed. The mansion slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Quiet halls, polished floors, fresh flowers in tall vases. But something had changed. People who visited the house spoke in softer tones. The staff looked at Clara with new eyes, not as a simple caretaker, but as someone special. The piano in the corner was no longer just a decoration. It had become a symbol, a reminder of a night no one could forget. Clara still wore the same gray dress. She still did her job with care, but her heart felt lighter. Every morning, before starting her chores, she sat at the piano. Just for a few minutes. She played soft melodies that filled the empty house with life. It became a new habit, like breathing. Adrian began spending more time at home. He no longer hosted loud parties. Instead, he walked through the garden, sat in the library, or listened quietly when Clara played. He spoke to her gently, always respectful, never proud. He was not the same man she had met months ago. He had changed, not because of money, not because of guilt, but because he had finally allowed himself to feel again. One day, Clara received a letter in the mail. It was from the music foundation Adrian had contacted. They had listened to the small video recording someone had taken during her performance that night. They were deeply moved. The letter was an official invitation to perform at a charity concert in the city. Clara stared at the letter for a long time. Her hands trembled. She had dreamed of this once, long ago, when she was still a girl with stars in her eyes and music in her heart. But now the dream had returned. Adrian found her sitting on the garden bench, the letter in her hand. They want me to perform, she said quietly. I know, he replied with a small smile. I was hoping they would. Clara looked at him. What if I fail? You won't, he said simply. But even if you do, you'll fail with music in your soul. That's more than most people ever feel. Clara nodded slowly. Deep inside, she knew he was right. The day of the concert came. The city hall was full of people. Men in suits, women in dresses, reporters, musicians. Clara stood behind the curtain, her hands cold, her heart pounding. But she wasn't afraid. Not like before. She thought of her father, who once saved coins to pay for her first music class. She thought of her teacher who had said, "Clara, you are not just playing notes, you're telling stories." She thought of the mansion, the piano, the laughter, the challenge. She thought of Adrian, and she smiled. When the curtain lifted and the lights came on, she walked calmly to the piano in the center of the stage. The hall was full, but she felt alone with the keys. She took a deep breath and began to play. The music rose like a gentle wind. It wrapped around every heart in the room. It was honest, pure, full of love and sorrow, hope and courage. It didn't try to be perfect, it only tried to be real. When the last note faded, the hall was silent, just like that night in the mansion. Then came the applause. Loud, long. Some people stood up. Some wiped their eyes. The sound filled the hall, but Clara sat quietly, her eyes closed. She had done it. Backstage, Adrian waited. He didn't speak when she came off the stage. He just looked at her. And she looked back. This time, no words were needed. Months passed. Clara still worked at the mansion, but her life had changed. She performed at small concerts, gave piano lessons to children, and even recorded her first album. Adrian supported her every step of the way, not with money, but with respect. They spent more time together, walking in the garden, sharing stories over tea. There was no rush, no pressure. Just a quiet understanding growing between them. One evening, as they sat by the piano, Adrian asked gently, "Do you remember what I said the night you played for the first time?" Clara smiled. "Yes, you said, 'If you can play, I'll marry you.'" Adrian laughed softly. "And you played." Clara looked at him. "Do you still mean it?" He didn't smile this time. He looked into her eyes and said, "More than ever, but only if you want to. Not because of a joke, not because of music. Because of you." Clara was silent for a moment. Then she reached out and placed her hand over his. "I think," she said gently, "this time I'll be the one to decide." He nodded, his heart full, and there in the quiet of the mansion, beside the piano that had started it all, a new story began, not one of pride or power, but of music, love, and the courage to be seen.